What if I told you that for centuries, women were stripped in public, tied to whipping posts and beaten, not for murder or theft, but for speaking too boldly, for disobeying a man, or simply for being seen as improper? Across history, Babylon, Egypt, Rome, medieval Europe, and colonial America, public whipping was one of the most brutal, humiliating tools of social control. But it was used disproportionately against women. Today, we uncover those stories, the tools, the systems, the survivors. Let's examine 3 hidden truths about public whipping that most history books ignore. We'll begin where civilization itself began, with ancient laws that first turned punishment into performance. Babylon. One of the earliest legal references to public whipping comes from the Code of Hammurabi, written around 1754 BCE. This Babylonian law code laid out strict punishments, including whipping, for a variety of crimes. But significantly, it often imposed harsher penalties on women. For example, Law 143 states, "If the woman is not innocent of wrongdoing, she shall be bound and thrown into the water." While whipping is less explicitly mentioned than death or mutilation, archaeological interpretations suggest that women who neglected household duties or were accused of disobedience could be punished by flogging, particularly enslaved women or those from lower classes. Ancient Greece and Rome. In both ancient Greece and Rome, public whipping was a legal and accepted form of punishment, particularly for enslaved people and women. In Rome, enslaved women were commonly whipped for minor offenses, often in public courtyards or marketplaces. The flagrum, a whip with bone or metal shards, was used not only to cause pain, but to leave permanent scars. Although Roman citizens could not be flogged without trial, women were frequently denied equal protection. Roman law allowed husbands to discipline their wives, and in some cases, even arrange for them to be whipped for perceived disobedience. One notorious example involves Valeria Messalina, the wife of Emperor Claudius. While her punishment was ultimately death, Roman historians like Tacitus mention that she was paraded and humiliated publicly before her execution, indicating how Roman society saw public shame as a form of justice. Religious morality and public shame. Medieval Europe. During the Middle Ages, the Christian Church had enormous influence over legal systems. Sin and crime were often treated interchangeably, especially when it came to women's bodies and behavior. The punishment for adultery, gossip, prostitution, or even assertiveness could be whipping, often in public. Towns frequently maintained whipping posts in the center of marketplaces. One 14th-century record from York, England, shows a woman named Alice Wade whipped publicly for being a common scold, essentially for being outspoken. Scolding, a crime almost exclusively applied to women, was punishable by whipping or public dunking. In France, prostitutes were frequently sentenced to public whippings, particularly if they were caught soliciting near churches. These events were not only tolerated but were performances of moral purification. The public was expected to attend and witness sinners being punished. The Spanish Inquisition, while more known for torture and executions, also used public whipping as a method of penance. Women accused of heresy or moral deviancy could be sentenced to lashes during religious processions. They were often paraded barefoot, partially unclothed, and whipped by clergy or officials. One case from 1491 in Seville involved a woman named Maria de Cazalla, who was accused of mysticism and heretical writings. Though spared execution, she was whipped publicly and forced to do penance. Her story survives in part because of the dramatic trial records preserved by the Inquisition. The colonial era. In the 1600s, the American colonies adopted many of the corporal punishment practices of England, but often with even stricter enforcement under Puritan ideology. Women were punished not only for crimes, but for moral violations. Gossip, rebellion, adultery, wearing immodest clothing, or speaking out. Dorothy Talbot was publicly whipped for sullen behavior toward her husband in 1639. Her case is one of the first recorded instances of a mentally ill woman being punished instead of treated. She was later executed for allegedly murdering her child, but her early punishments showed how the system dealt with disobedient women. And Hibbins, another Boston widow, was whipped and later hanged for witchcraft in 1656. Though modern historians agree her real crime was likely being a wealthy woman who refused to stay silent. Whipping posts stood in town squares, where crowds gathered to watch. Officials often forced women to disrobe partially to increase the shame factor. Clergy justified this as a method to correct women and deter others. The American South and slavery. Enslaved women in the American South were perhaps the most brutalized group through whipping. They were whipped not only for resisting work or fleeing, but for sexual resistance, for childbirth complications, or simply for not appearing submissive enough. Harriet Jacobs, in her memoir Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, recounts how enslaved girls were whipped for being temptations to their white owners, essentially blamed for the abuse they suffered. Frederick Douglass wrote of witnessing his Aunt Hester whipped for meeting a man without permission. Her screams, he said, haunted him for the rest of his life. These whippings were often done on platforms or in front of other enslaved people to serve as a warning. The physical scars left on their backs were matched by emotional scars that endured for generations. In 1756, a London woman named Mary Davis sued her accuser after being wrongly whipped in public. She lost the case, but her action made headlines. Public whipping wasn't just about law enforcement. It was a tool of control, especially over women.